Or we didn't even think to communicate. Ah, now it's on. So thank you for turning this back on. We're good. So they're back from lunch. We'll get started. We're running a little bit late. We'll probably run a little bit over. It's partly because of the fullness of these days and the conversations and the city and the rain and all the things that make transportation and translation across continents and regions so surprising and doesn't necessarily follow the prescribed rhythms of a traditional academic conference. So I'm Sarah Geyer, and our task today is to talk a little bit about and represent CHCI's interventions in global, international, and world projects. I'm joined by four representatives of two projects, the World Humanities Report and the Global Humanities Institutes. I'm going to say a little bit by way of an opening about these projects, and then I will hand things over to each of our panelists, who will talk for 5, 7, 8, 9-ish minutes. And then hopefully we'll have enough time to have a conversation, which I also hope will continue throughout the rest of the afternoon and evening, not least because our final keynote is also on this panel. So some of the conversations that we'll have at the final keynote have as one point of their origin, not the only one, the World Humanities Report. So I want to, again, as many have already done, thank Pablo and the organizers and Diego, and thank Guillaume and Aaron for incredible work, and also to acknowledge the Mellon Foundation. I don't know if Carolyn Dinshaw is here, but the Mellon Foundation was absolutely central in CHCI's international turn. And our panel is called Translating the Humanities, and our purpose is to reflect on this turn within CHCI, but translating, far from being a process that becomes complete, is one that's ongoing and that in fact signals our own approach to internationalization as an organization. In fact, it's indissociable from questions of language and multilingualism, and one of the things that we've accomplished over the past couple of days is had the first multilingual or bilingual CHCI conference, which is really testament to translation as core to how CHCI has thought about the move outside of North America and Europe, which is simultaneously a move outside and in collaboration with the non-Anglophone world, or the non-Anglophone world. And in fact, one of our first Global Humanities Institutes, which took place here, had translation as its topic. So there are resonances and resonances and resonances. But translating and translational also has another use in universities and outside of the humanities, where it turns out that it's indissociable from the international turn, but also from the scientific or medical turn to larger publics and outside of the university. So at least in North America, when those in the scientific fields, particularly medicine, think about how their research in a lab, what's sometimes called basic research, moves outside, the term that's often used for that work, and this is also to anticipate our next panel, is translation or translational research. So that we're thinking about translation here in the humanities is certainly to think about languages and the movement of concepts across those languages and across continents, movement geographically and linguistically, but also to think always about the public, always to think about the ways in which we move from the university to, let's say, the people, which is something we've been talking about in this context over a series of conversations. So one of the things that I want to emphasize about CHCI's international turn is that it's a turn to thinking not only about other regions, but at the same time to think about the forms and locations of the humanities themselves, whether and when the humanities live within universities, where and how the humanities live. And we'll hear from examples, certainly in the Arab region and elsewhere, about the kind of humanities on the street, about the ways in which museums, as we heard yesterday, become arbiters of humanistic research. So to go historical for just a minute, in and around, let's say, 2010 and a little bit earlier, CHCI, and at that point the board and members of CHCI, began to recognize a set of gaps within the fabric of the organization. And that process of recognizing gaps seems to be core to who and what CHCI is, always asking the question, what is missing, and how can we find and represent other voices? So at the same time as recognizing gaps, CHCI and the board at that moment also began to develop some strategies to address them. While there were members of CHCI from Cambridge and Edinburgh and Australia, and while many and even most of us had an international dimension to our own research, working in archives or languages outside of our homes, the institutional projects tended to be, as in most cases they still remain, pretty much bilateral, where two universities establish some sort of contractual partnership, some kind of exchange, and in most instances, there needs to be a degree of institutional sameness in order for those exchanges to take place. So a university in Italy or in Germany comes in to a relationship with a university in Canada. And that is how a lot of internationalization came to work in the United States. So that seemed to actually be very different from the model of internationalization that CHCI was interested in thinking about, which wasn't bilateral. At the same time, several of us were also thinking about what came to be called the Public Humanities Network. And representatives from, at the time, Wisconsin, Michigan, Australian National University, University of Washington, Harvard, met at Duke with the initial focus of forming a public humanities network, but at that same time, we also took up internationalization. And it was in that set of conversations, really, that our first Mellon projects focused on international collaborations and international partnerships were hatched. And the real reason that I point to this is only to say that for CHCI, the question of the public and the question of the international or the global, as we think about the humanities, have always been intertwined. It's never been an opposition. But if we are going to think about questions of justice, if we're going to think about questions of access, we can use our international partnerships to read what's happening domestically, wherever domestic is located for each of us in this room. And if we're going to think about relationships of access between the university and the broader world, those partnerships actually have helped us to figure out how to do public humanities, because much of what we'll hear about, whether it's in Chicago or in Colombia or in Beirut, or in Dublin, are versions of the public humanities. So I wanted to give that as an overview to let you know something about CHCI. Now, as we were in the midst of these projects, starting to kind of seed and support collaborations, many of which are represented in this room when I look at colleagues from Cape Town and I look at colleagues from Dublin and ANU and elsewhere. As we're starting to build these international projects, we also were invited by the Mellon Foundation to try to take stock of the humanities in the world in a more kind of systematic way, although systematic from the perspective of the humanities. So we didn't start with a survey where we reached out to every humanities center director department in the world that we could find and asked them to fill out a set of predetermined questions. But we needed to find a way to represent what is the state of the humanities in the world at this moment. Where are there areas of risk? Where are there areas of flourishing? Where is there extinction risk? Where are there possibilities to make recommendations, even demands, that would ensure the ongoing persistence, but ultimately really the flourishing of the humanities across the world? So Mellon invited us to take up and lead this project, and Mellon also had this other agenda in doing that at the time, and the other agenda was to try to bring together two international humanities organizations, us and another organization, the International Council for Philosophy and Human Sciences, CHCI, based in Europe. And it was an interesting project to try to bring together a North American located and inflected project committed to certain notions of academic freedom and a European slash, at that time, Chinese located project was committed to a different kind of survival, I would say, and the survival of the humanities in Europe, which had grown increasingly precarious, despite the physical institutions. And I'll stop in a minute. So that collaboration turned out to be not nearly as successful as the report itself. It turned out that effort at matchmaking didn't quite work, and we maybe can reflect a little bit about some of the after effects of that. One of the things is that most of us more or less know what's going on in Western Europe in the humanities. More or less. And if we don't know, we know how to find that information, at least in English, or in French, or in Spanish, because there are an enormous number of reports about the European humanities. And so figuring out how the European humanities would fit into a World Humanities Report, shockingly, turned out to be one of the most difficult parts of the World Humanities Report, as if we couldn't actually solve or address the question of the world and the decentering that such a project required, and also have fully fledged European participation from an institutional perspective, not from an individual perspective, but from an institutional perspective. So the World Humanities Report, and today, thanks to Guillaume's heroic efforts, you actually can see the kind of first iteration of it on the website. So the first tranche of articles and essays by some people sitting here are actually published online. So it's worldhumanitiesreport.org, and it's beautiful. And but the idea behind the World Humanities Report wasn't, as I said earlier, wasn't just to be comprehensive and wasn't just to appropriate certain kind of social, scientific, or demographic tools and use them to read the humanities, but rather to start from the humanities. And it has created, to kind of repeat some of the conversations we heard several days ago, I can't tell you how many days ago it was, a series of instances, a series of cases, a series of singularities. Snapshots is one way that we thought about it. That allow us to see inside, in many ways, what's happening in the world. We commissioned about a dozen research teams. Most of them are organized regionally, but the point of the regional focus wasn't just to say, read your region, but read the world from where you're located, read the humanities in the world where you're located. Now, in some cases, the region is being read. In other cases, the kind of, and this goes to some of the work that Cotter described, the fact of exile or the fact of displacement means that to read a region is never to read a region, or to read one place is always to read many places. So with that kind of general overview, which is both to say CHCI has been for a long period of time committed to exploring the possibility of international collaboration at the same time as it asks the question, where are the gaps in our organization, and how do we address those? And to say, what would it be for humanists, all of us, to present account of the humanities in our own terms, and including, and one of the things I also want to highlight, I wasn't sure if they'd put it up or not, that's why I'm turning. One of the things I wanted to highlight is there are a series of 10 recommendations, and one hope that we have, and one conversation I want to invite all of you to participate in, is that we hope that this report can be useful for all of you, whether you're making arguments to administrators, provosts, presidents and chancellors, or vice chancellors or rectors, whether you're making arguments to the state, whether you're making arguments to funders, whether you're making arguments to partners outside of the humanities. The 10 recommendations here show what it is, I think, our task to do individually, but the task of our institutions to do institutionally. And I don't know that there are many places, if any, where there is that kind of account of what is needed in order for the humanities to flourish, coupled with an incredibly, as you'll see, gorgeous, inspiring, and sometimes frightening account of where the humanities are, or where they're at risk in our world today. So the way we're going to structure this panel, and I invite you to go to the directory and read the long and substantial bios of our my sororal, not fellow, presenters, we'll start with Jane Ohlmeyer, who's coming to us from Trinity, who was the leader of one of the first of our Global Humanities Institutes and also a participant in the World Humanities Report. And then Setni Shami will talk a little bit about the Arab region contribution to the World Humanities Report. Lydia Liu will talk about the work on China, and Maria Costa will talk about the work that she's contributed to the section on the Americas, not least because it truly represents the Americas and not only North and South as distinct regions. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you, Sarah, and lovely to see everybody this afternoon. The focus of my remarks really will be on our Global Humanities Institute, though I will say a few words about the European version of the World Humanities Report towards the end. At the very outset, though, I want to thank CHCI and the Mellon Foundation. I don't know if our colleague from Mellon is in the room, but it's very hard to overstate how enabling this opportunity was. And in my remarks, I'd like to really reflect on what the impact and what the GHI enabled. I think it's a very interesting case study of where a relatively modest grant, and I'm not belittling the amount because obviously it was, a significant, but it's a relatively modest amount, has really been a game changer. But I actually think with a little bit of follow-up funding, really could achieve so much more. In other words, we have begun something, the full potential of which remains to be unlocked. And I'll also reflect on how we might go about getting some of that funding. But I think Mellon was hugely important in getting this going, and I would love to think that Mellon would stay on this international journey. Let's leave it at that. A couple of things, though. Let me just, before I go into the impact and how the GHI was such an enabler, I want to say a few words about what it was. So we had a European grant on, it was a European mobility grant on cultural trauma, which brought a number of non-European and European universities together. And obviously cultural trauma is a huge topic. And when the opportunity for the GHI came along, we thought, well, let's refocus this and look at the crisis of democracy through the prism or through the lens of cultural trauma. So we went back to some of our existing partners, people that we'd built relationships up with over a 3-year period. That was JNU in Delhi, the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, the University of Zagreb. And then we were absolutely thrilled to have Columbia University join that consortium. And what I was thrilled about was not just the caliber of people we were working with, but the diverse range of disciplines. We had people who worked in dance, film, history, literature, gender studies, political science, law, journalism, and I could keep on going. There were about 20 different disciplines from the arts, humanities, and a few of the social sciences. Anyway, what we did, we had a series of meetings that looked at the crisis of democracy through the prism of cultural trauma in specific geographic contexts. So we looked at Ireland, which is still in political crisis. Nothing has changed in the 5 years since we visited Stormont. We looked at Brazil, and Brazil at this point, it was the height of Bolsonaro's reign. And then we went to India, and of course India is still under authoritarian rule with Modi, who I note is being feted by Joe Biden at the moment. The centerpiece of the summer school was of the GHI was a 2-week summer school in Dubrovnik in Croatia. And it's very hard for me to articulate just how transformative that was, not just for the 20 early career researchers who were part of it, but for the 15 or so faculty. Originally, we thought people would drop in, drop out. Not a bit of it. Everybody was there for the 2 weeks, and it was an extraordinary experience because in addition to having, if you want, abstract and intellectual discussions, the emphasis was on the lived experience of crises of democracy and the lived experiences of trauma in the Balkans. So we visited places like Mostar, Sarajevo, and Srebrenica, and even that, the hairs on the back of my neck are standing up to see up close what had happened at Srebrenica, literally under the eyes of the United Nations, the Dutch delegation. I mean, it was shocking, and to speak and have opportunities to engage with the victims and those who have been working with them. It was a transformative experience for everybody who did that. So that was what we did. However, when the GHI ended, the collaborations continued because no sooner had we finished, our last meeting was in Delhi in 2019. COVID was already circulating, folks, let's face it. But what we wanted to do as COVID took hold of the world was to say, well, what does the pandemic mean for democracy? So we organized an online series of seminars called Crisis of Democracy in a Time of Pandemic, and it was the Trinity Long Room Hub and the Heyman that were the SOF Heyman Center for the Humanities in Colombia that were the two anchors, and involved our colleagues from India, from Brazil, and of course India and Brazil were two, apart from the United States, were the two worst affected countries, and we had many of our colleagues who'd been involved in the GHI, including Rishia, who is speaking later in the Medical Humanities series. Those podcasts are all online, and Katrina Curtis from the Trinity Long Room Hub has put everything on the shared folder. So if anybody wants to go back and look at those podcasts, they're there. And the podcasts were just simply one of the outputs of the GHI. We developed a living curriculum, which actually was subsequently used in graduate student courses in Brazil. And for me, it's one thing to develop it, it's another thing to actually see it being used. It was used extensively in India, and of course, it's exactly at the moment that India is going through this crisis of democracy. We had the democracy riots as the board was meeting in Delhi. And I mentioned very briefly earlier some of the early career researchers who had been with us in Dubrovnik. They were using that curriculum and disseminating it with their fellow students who were bearing the brunt of the beatings, of the shootings, of the violations by Modi's thugs. So for me, this was the power of this. It was actually making a difference on the ground and helping these young people deal with the trauma that they were experiencing on the foot of state brutality. So the living curriculum is still there. It's now an orphan website, as so many of these things become, and I'll come back to that at the end. We produced a collection of essays. We're academics at the end of the day, and everybody loves to get a publication out of something. Our colleagues in Brazil edited the volume, and again, we've made it available to anybody who would like to read it. But Zara was the editor of a collection of essays. The third big thing that came out of it were a series of collaborations. And I want to just dwell on some of those for a moment, because it's like when you take a pebble, you drop it into a pond, and you get all of these sort of ripples. At a very personal level, I now have research collaborations with two of my colleagues who are on the GHI, Women in Sexual Violence, and Stephanie McCurry at Columbia and Rosemary Byrne, who was at Trinity and is now at NYU Abu Dhabi. We've just edited an issue of Law and History. I hope they're going to publish it. But anyway, it wouldn't have happened without that experience. That's the personal thing. But it's had many other wonderful sets of engagements. In Ireland, we start close to home. It really shaped the mission of the Trinity Long Room Hub. And out of it, we established a Centre for Resistance that is still extremely vibrant, again, led by colleagues who are very involved in the GHI. It helped us secure philanthropic funding that allowed us to establish the Schuler Democracy funding, the Schuler Democracy Forum, and that has been really active in an Irish context. They've got a wonderful podcast series called The History of the Future. Again, very much focused around these issues of democracy. It enabled us to secure national funding for a program that was very much based on community engagement and democracy. So in that Irish local context, without the GHI, none of that actually would have happened. Let's move it up from the local to the global, because I actually think this is where COVID sort of cut us off at the knees a little bit. But at the global level, we have now a group of academics that I think will be friends for the rest of our lives. That bonding that occurred, especially in Dubrovnik, is hard to overstate. But it's not just the academics, it's the early career researchers. They formed this global network, and again, in a very powerful way. And they've done it themselves. Nobody is guiding that. We followed up with a grant, a big grant to the European Union. Anyone from Europe will be very aware the European Union is throwing money at projects that engage with the democracy initiative, because they all realize that what's going on in the world is just horrific, and we all need to fight very hard for democracy. Now, we did put in a grant. We didn't get it. So I'm at a university where somebody called Beckett, the playwright Beckett, try harder, fail better. It's like you just keep on going, and we will reapply for European money. But actually, that allowed us to bring in another university, and I think Moritz is with us, Pramesh Lalu, Moritz, Haiti, UWC, the Centre for Humanities Research, have joined, if you want, this consortium, and we will continue to apply for European funding. And I want to make one final comment, because in addition to these amazing collaborations that, as I say, we will continue to use as the platform to apply for European funding and other funding, if ever we can find it, it also demonstrated to me and other colleagues the power of interdisciplinarity. It became very clear to us, none of the great wicked problems and challenges of the world, they're all extraordinarily complicated, and that means they need complicated solutions, and that involves bringing disciplines together. So myself and Katrina and other colleagues, we applied to the European Commission for a grant that allowed us to explore interdisciplinarity and deep collaboration, not just across the arts, humanities, and social sciences, but how we could do this with STEM. and it resulted in a project called Shape ID. And that project has become a bit of a poster child project for the European Commission because we developed a toolkit. It's very practical about how AHSS researchers can collaborate with STEM researchers, but above all, how they can take leadership roles. It's about leading the discussion rather than being followers. So it's found its mark with the Commission, which is tremendous, but also the League of European Research Universities, an organization called LERU, has taken it on board, and we've just published a LERU report on interdisciplinarity, and our work is really at the heart of that. And again, that came out of the GHI. So it's, well, again, if the person from Mellon, little did you realize you're actually influencing how the European Commission is going about interdisciplinarity. But it also found its mark in Ireland itself. Ireland is a little country, 5.5 million people. We're a suburb of New York. And it influenced then how the Irish government is engaging with interdisciplinarity and the humanities. And Sarah, I just want to say, the one issue, the one challenge is funding. It's all very well to start all of these projects, but it's very ad hoc how they actually proceed in terms of you don't get funding to sustain them and to develop them and to curate them. Some things will flourish and some things are, others will die. So my basic message is, what can we do then to make sure we can sustain these really empowering initiatives? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you to Sarah, to Guillaume, to the organizers and hosts of this conference. It's really a pleasure to be here. Through my decades of academia, I had very little chance to come to Latin America or to interact with Latin American scholars. In the past few years, I've been invited to Argentina and Mexico and now Chile, so I think something is happening. And perhaps the Middle East and Latin America will be in more conversations with one another. One of the great silences in academia are the huge Arab populations, or originally Arab populations of Latin America. In fact, Palestinians in Chile, Lebanese, Syrian in Argentina, in Mexico, in Brazil, and there's very little research on that. This is not my topic, but I just wanted to acknowledge really what a pleasure it is to be here and to get to know another academic community or communities. When we were invited as the Arab Council for Social Sciences to contribute to the World Humanities Report, we accepted with enthusiasm, and it was a precious opportunity. There's so many things I want to say. I'm going to stick to what I prepared, but I could go in many different directions. But maybe just as a preamble and to kind of contextualize what I am going to say, the Arab Council for Social Sciences, the ACSS, is a very young organization. We're in our 12th year. And 4 of these years have been marked by acute crises, as I will talk a little further. So the invitation to join this initiative came just as we were sort of feeling that we were now established and we could participate in projects and contribute to them. And then a lot of this, as we just heard, was cut short by the pandemic. We had to reorganize, we had to rethink, we had to figure out different ways of working both regionally and globally. But this is sort of a preamble to say we did focus on region, despite the instructions. And this is because we, as the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, were trying to figure out what this Arab region was as far as we were concerned, and the region was trying to figure out who we were and what we could do regionally. So the question, there are many, many questions in our section of the report, but the one that I thought I would focus on a little bit in this presentation is how do you represent a region through the humanities? But the other way of asking this is how do the humanities construct a region? So that's sort of the frame of my remarks. So the work was undertaken by an editorial board of 4 women, myself and 3 remarkable colleagues, and a research team of 3 young creative researcher activists. You know, in our chapter or our section, there's information on the board and on the research group. So in addition to the COVID-19 pandemic, which we had to cope with, as did the rest of the world, this work also began in the context of a second wave of uprisings in the Arab region. So the first Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring in 2010, 2011, which took place mainly in Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, and Yemen. But the second wave in 2018, 2019 in Sudan, Algeria, Iraq, and Lebanon was sort of cut short by the pandemic, or we don't know what would have happened if the pandemic had not come into this context of mass uprisings. And so listening to the experience of Chile in October 2019, in Lebanon, we were also in a revolution in October 2019, where 1.5 million people were in the streets, and this is in a country of 4 million. So it was really a moment whose lessons we have not understood, and whose repercussions, on which repercussions are still with us. At the same time, there was a severe financial, and there is a severe financial and banking crisis in Lebanon, which led to the freezing of all foreign currency accounts, including our own donor grant monies. And then there was the huge explosion in the port of Beirut in August 2020, you might have heard of, where an unexplained deposit of, I don't know how many tons of fertilizer exploded for unknown reasons and created a sonic boom that devastated the neighboring city, killed hundreds, displaced 300,000 people, and from which the city has not yet recovered. So in the midst of all of this, clearly one of the questions that we were asking ourselves about the humanities, about the social sciences, about life itself is, you know, how do we make sense and how do we make meaning in this kind of context, and who makes meaning and what kinds of meaning. One last point before I get into the more substantive issues is that one of the reasons why this was a precious opportunity for us is that the Arab region is pretty much absent in a lot of global surveys. And if you look at edited volumes or volumes on comparative this or that, you'll see a big hole for where the Arab region and the Middle East more generally is absent. And those of us who live there, we don't know why, but why this is the case. But part of it has to do with a sort of exceptionalism that is generally applied to this part of the world. And so when it is, for example, in political science, if the Arab region is part of a project or a volume, then it's always in terms of authoritarianism and sort of the cultural and the vitality of the region tends to be sort of reduced to oil, gas, refugees, you know, a few tropes, a few sorts of topics that tend to frame the way which we understand this part of the world. It is a very complex region, 22 countries that are members of the League of Arab States, spread across West Asia and North Africa. It has some of the wealthiest countries in the world, some of the poorest. Fully half of these countries are in a state of active conflict and war. And the region both produces and hosts the largest number of refugees and displaced people in the world. It's also the arena of external military intervention by both regional and global powers. And one of the challenges is how not to underplay this state of polycrisis and of militarism and of war, how not to underplay it, but at the same time, without erasing the struggles for change, for democracy, for inclusivity that are equally important, even if they are much less powerful in material terms. So one of the things we tried to show in this report was the amount of energy and creativity across the region that is expended towards more democratic and inclusive polities in the face of persistent obstruction from above. The focus on geopolitics plays into this erasure of the region from global scenarios. And so I think in the report, the authors we worked with did a really good effort to try and bring together both sort of the overwhelming odds against which the peoples of the region are struggling, but also give due respect and due place for the struggles and the attempts to change and reshape the countries, the communities, the societies we live in. And the humanities and humanities knowledge is definitely part of these struggles. So there are three main sections to the Arab region report. We did do a section on sort of a mapping of official institutions such as universities, research centers, associations, periodicals, because we wanted to understand the infrastructure for knowledge production that exists in the region. And because part of the crises we deal with is a crisis in public data. There's incredible lack of access to data in our part of the world, which is why, again, this part of the world is often absent in kind of global surveys and so on, because that kind of data just doesn't exist. And this is due to both official secretiveness and to the increasing privatization and corporatization of data. So both officialdom and the private sector know that knowledge is power, and they try to keep knowledge very contained within very small circles. And so our attempt to create publicly accessible databases which present this kind of information on the infrastructure of knowledge production is, we think, a valuable sort of attempt to change or to rectify this kind of situation. But secondly, and an exciting part of our report was to look at the less visible projects, not the official universities, research centers, periodicals, and so on, but the less visible projects of critical humanities, which includes news outlets, arts and culture projects, knowledge platforms, collectives, most of which operate outside higher education institutions and often are exclusively online. So these projects demonstrate that critical humanistic knowledge is not only produced in academic circles, and in fact, less and less so in the face of diminishing resource in universities and research institutions. These projects signal the potential of pedagogical, socioeconomic, cultural transformation in the region, especially when we consider the afterlives of the critical knowledge that they produce. Just to read some of the names of these platforms and projects, I think gives you a sense of the creativity and really excitement around these sorts of platforms. So we have one which is called Kohol, a journal for body and gender research. We have a platform called Creative Memory of the Syrian Revolution, another one from Syria called Syria Untold, Nubian Geographic, Other Maps of Egypt, Legal Agenda, Arab Media Lab, Arab Image Foundation, Khaza'in, which means closets and also means treasure chest, Mawzoon, which means scales, both in the meaning of musical scales and also weights and measures. So these are just some of the projects and collectives and so on that the report actually describes and analyzes, and in their own words, as well as in sort of a more analytical way by our authors. And here, and then the third part of the report is 25 essays, which we invited people to write as forward-looking thought pieces and about, exploring the past and futures of humanistic knowledge and criticality. And I should say, everybody responded so positively to this invitation. We hardly got turned down. Everyone was quite prompt in delivering their pieces. And I think one of the reasons people were enthusiastic to accept our invitation was because we told them that these did not have to be written as academic pieces. They could be thought pieces. They could be, they should reflect their personal as well as their research agendas, and the authors really responded to this and really wrote. I think all of the essays are brilliant and very exciting and open up a world of possibilities. And we heard from many of them that they would say, I've been waiting to write this kind of piece, and there was just no place to write it for before. And this is, another long discussion we could have about how academic journals particularly force authors to frame their work in certain ways that often does not reflect what they're really trying to communicate. And that's a long discussion. So the essays are divided into 5 sections. And I'll just read the titles of the sections, and then that will be the last.
And then they're all
they're all there.
The sections, it's all published.
But I just want to read the rubrics because I think they give a sense of where we think the essays, or what we think the essays are trying to communicate. So the first section is called Layered Hegemonies, Academic Imaginaries, and we're trying to go beyond reductionist sort of north-south, south-south, etc., colonial, decolonial, and to understand the very layered ways in which the interplay of intellectual traditions, colonial dominations, modernist projects, and neoliberal forces, and how they all work together to structure what gets researched, how it gets researched, and to what ends. The second section is called Urgency and Temporality, and this very much reflects the context. As I said, everybody was writing these pieces in the context of war and displacement and crisis and so on. The third section is called Feminist Platforms, and here what was particularly came to light in this particular section of feminist platforms was the interplay between the institutional and the interstitial. And where does feminist research sort of thrive? Does it thrive in the institutional formats or more in interstitial, more sort of marginalized spaces? And the final section, no, not the final, but the fourth section was on translating and traveling genres. And this sort of explored how humanistic knowledge emerges from the encounter between different knowledge traditions across both time and space, with a focus on the digital age. And the last section was on urban imaginaries and landscapes as the setting of some of the world's oldest cities and some of its newest megapolises. Then the urban was a very important incubator of new narratives, images, and life worlds that we wanted to capture. So finally, I just wanted to say along the lines of that was already expressed here, that this work on this report complemented and extended other projects at the ACSS, a research grants program that we have been running for 5 years with a sister organization called the Arab Foundation for Arts and Culture, a working group on ethnography as knowledge, which has produced important work on ethnography in crisis, a working group on the decolonizing from North Africa that has organized a conference and a training institute, Our recent 6th conference just a few weeks ago was on producing critical knowledge in the Arab region and brought over 400 researchers and cultural producers to debate the themes that I have outlined. A final word, which I think is important in this context, is that we really did not focus, we were not invested in disciplinary boundaries in this report. And we felt it was, although we recognize that many disciplines are in deep crisis in the universities of our region and that they need attention and they need help, but in this particular report, we really focused on criticality as the theme rather than disciplinary knowledge, although the disciplines obviously get discussed in the various essays. And our goal was to help transform these inherited categories of knowledge that work to segregate and to exclude instead of to aggregate and to include. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
One thing that I've learned in this conference is that humanities mean different things to different people in different places. I don't think there is a particular need for us to defend or justify the existence of the humanities to this audience. But whenever I'm called upon to do just that, which happens often, I was saying that there is no particular need to justify the existence of the humanities to this audience, but I'm often called upon to do just that. So when that happens, I simply invite the people to imagine a world in which the humanities were absent, or the humanities couldn't contribute significantly to social life. It would not be a world in which I want to live. This is not an argument you should be using to your administrators, to your deans. I think you should be using the World Humanities Report. And there's a lot you can find in there to help you. In his memorial lecture yesterday, Santiago tried to reframe the idea of the international, making it relevant again to our political engagement with an emerging world order of multipolarity. I think that was a brilliant move. In particular, his emphasis on the international as opposed to the imperial is meaningful to this gathering of member institutes of CHCI, because the international can open up some avenues of thinking. I mean, his reframing of the international can open up some avenues of thinking that will benefit our discussion and also transform our work. We would not gain much clarity on the role of the humanities if we were content with our own parochial preoccupations in our universities and paid little attention to what is going on elsewhere in the world. In fact, many of our annual conferences have been held in the global south, such as this one in Santiago. Thank you for your wonderful work organizing this conference, where interesting and surprising encounters do happen, both intellectually and academically, where gaps and fissures can be identified, where social struggles can be made legible across national and regional boundaries through the work of translation and comparison. I want to thank all the interpreters in the back who are the hardest working participants in this conference. And this is where the value of the World Humanities Report can be grasped. As Sarah has mentioned, CHCI undertook this ambitious project a few years ago. That was before the pandemic. Under her visionary leadership, the navigation between the local and the global, between the global south and the global north, and across the disciplines has not been an easy task. But the work is incredibly important once you take a look at the report itself. It is important for how we understand our world and how we achieve self-understanding. And this project is still in progress because many of the pieces are still being translated. I myself have played a small part, a very marginal role in the making of the regional report from PRC, which has turned out to be less a report than a multi-chapter book about the state of the humanities, and in particular the disciplines in the Chinese humanities. So this is very different from what Sandy was saying. What comes out from that report is a very comprehensive, but also very detailed, interpretive, as well as data-driven sub-reports on archaeology, history, literature, linguistics, what we consider as the traditional disciplines. But there's a lot going on in those reports other than the report on the state of the disciplines. Nothing like this exists at this comprehensive level, and often at granular levels as well. The editor of this substantial report is one of our board members, Wang Hui, a distinguished literary scholar and historian based at Tsinghua University in Beijing, who cannot join us at this conference. I see myself as filling his role here, speaking on his behalf. His general introduction has been translated, is already published online, so you can, I encourage you to take a look at his very lengthy introduction. I think the PRC report is precisely the kind of work that has the potential of interrupting the play of mirrors between the global south and the global north. That play of mirrors, I see myself in your image and back and forth until these representations and self-understandings get completely entangled and becomes confusing. So we end up in ignorance rather than in any level of knowing. And it also leads to distrust, phobias, and dangerous consequences. The sad truth is that people just don't know much about China. Neither its past nor the present. When people talk about China in the media, I ask, are you talking about the figment of your imagination? We know, for example, that's what most people know, in academia, that meritocracy runs deep in Chinese history, which has long contributed to the institutions of political authority, education, and classical learning. For more than a millennium, the imperial civil service examination had largely determined the selection of officials, government officials, from all walks of society, encouraging upward mobility in society. What we do not know, however, is that after the Imperial Civil Service examination was abolished in 1905, following the suppression of the Boxer Uprising by the 8 Allied powers. If you read the treaty, it's written in the treaty that you must abolish student tests because these are troublemakers. So after the abolition of the Imperial Civil Service examination, what has happened to that, the tradition of learning? Do the Confucius classics mean the same thing today as they did in the past? I think the PRC report does address this question and address it deeply. Are the humanities in trouble, such as we witness elsewhere in the world in regard to funding? So this is one place we could make comparison. If so, can we identify the sources of that trouble beyond funding? In his general introduction to the regional report, Wang Hui describes the modern university in China as a direct outcome of the country's pursuit of military, scientific, industrial, and political strength in face of Western colonialism and imperialism. The role of science has been crucial to that pursuit, and one must not leave it out when we talk about the humanities. The situation, however, seems more complex than the rivalries of the scientists and the humanists fighting for resources. In China, the National Social Science Fund provides ample support for the humanities, as well as for the social sciences. And recently, there has been an astronomical jump in that support. So funding is not the problem. And I think institutes and research centers that need support elsewhere might use this as an excuse to plead for funding. One key observation that comes out of the PRC report is that it is not the government control of the freedom of expression nor the lack of funding that is negatively impacting the humanities. The humanities in China have been weakened by the competitive logic of neoliberal developmentalism that drives the performance indicators and global university ranking everywhere. You think of CHCI, you think of HCI, Humanities Citation Index, for example, and China has its own version of those. In fact, before I joined CHCI, I participated in a Columbia initiative led by Sheldon Pollock. We convened in Bombay in the Columbia Global Center, where we invited, Columbia faculty invited a lot of scholars from the Global South to compare notes. Wang Hui was there, and a scholar from Taiwan was there, and some scholars from Egypt, from Africa, from the Middle East, from India were also there. Rashid Khalidi was there, Mamadou Diop. We were comparing notes, and then they published a short report on that. Okay, so we were surprised that SSCI and HCI started being implemented by the ministries of education around the world in the Global South, starting in the 90s. So That's really coincides. And this is what is damaging the humanities. And the same logic which turns the humanities into soft power or some kind of competitive resources is depriving the humanities of their vital role in sustaining the diversity of cultures, religions, and classical learning, and self-understanding. So I'm going to conclude. But that is not the end of the story. In the context of this conference, we must also ask what difference the Chinese Revolution makes in the midst of the struggle. The struggle over the future of socialism in China is far from over. And by extension, we need to reiterate a Marxist question. What prospects of transformation are opened up or made available by the contradictions of capitalism itself? If we are open and if we are attentive to that question, we will begin to understand where China stands in solidarity with similar struggles in other parts of the world, especially in the global south. I'll stop there.
And we have, I've heard we can go until 3:30 if needed, so.
I'll just speak for 5 minutes.
I want to make sure we have time for questions.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much. It is such an honor to be in this table and hear all the amazing work that the people at this table have done for this report. My contribution was very small, and I'll get to talk more about it during my lecture later today, so I don't want to devote time to the details of what my contribution was, but I just wanted to do a couple of things. First, like everyone else in the table, thank Sarah for having organized this initiative. I didn't know what I was being invited to, and only now I realize actually what the World Humanities Report really is, like in its immensity. But I'm very thankful that I had the opportunity to contribute in such an important project, and also thank the team that worked very, very hard to make all of these publications that you will find online possible. So Guillaume, who's here, and Mary Muriel and Anna Paretskaya, who those of you who have been working for the report have probably been in touch with them many, many times, back and forth, editing the volume. I just wanted to say a couple of things. I don't want to take more time than that, but I do agree with what Jane was saying before, that the publication of the report should just be the beginning. It has been an immense amount of work, but it should just be the beginning, because my hope, and since the first time I talked to Sarah, this is what really made it compelling, is that once it is published, we will see the possibilities of collaborating across disciplines and in what Jane was calling the true global perspective. And I think especially for places where these collaborations are not easy because of a lack of time, because of a lack of resources, but also because of the lack of knowledge of who is doing what and where, then this will be an amazing opportunity. And if more funding comes in order to make that possible, that will be great. I already want to see all the places in the report where people were writing about cultural trauma, where they were writing about memory initiatives, creative ways of resistance. All of the themes that have been mentioned already will be so important for the people who collaborated, for instance, for the report I coordinated. So I'm excited about the future. Also, these comparative encounters, and I would also agree with Lydia here, are challenging and should be challenging. It should not be only about finding each other, mirroring each other, and finding who is doing similar work, but also being tested and challenged by the kind of work that is being done elsewhere, and the difficulty of the differences, the difficulty of these cultural encounters that can bring so much more and can be so difficult to navigate, but it is so important that we get into that uncomfortable place and truly learn how to learn from one another. So I'm excited about that side of the project too. And I also think, like Seteni was saying, and I like the way you put it, it is not only about how the humanities represent a region, but how the humanities construct a region and construct the narrative of a region. So as you'll see with my lecture at the end of the day, this is what I also focused when I'm speaking about Colombia and Chicago and memory initiatives, is the power the humanities have to retell the story and therefore opening other possibilities of the future. The danger there is in letting the narrative be governed by a perspective that is not diverse and plural and responsible enough. So this is something that I think is very important, and that we need to know the power that we have when we tell the stories. So this is also, something we need to be aware of. Finally, just a call for something that I think is very important. I think it's very telling that I am the one writing the report on Colombia, and I am an institution in the United States. If I was a professor in Colombia, which I was for many years, I wouldn't have had the time to do what I did. And I'm not saying I have a lot of time in my hands, I single parent, I'm a full professor, I'm like in 1,000 committees, and I also write other stuff. But I did have the time. And this is something that is very telling about the situation of humanities in other places of the world. We are so privileged. I have always felt so privileged having the time to do this kind of work. And this says a lot about my university. It says a lot also about how our research is valued, but it also means that my colleagues in Colombia, they could not have done this. I am currently also directing a series on feminisms in Latin America, and it has been so challenging because our commitment has been to have people only from Latin America who are based in Latin America to write the contributions. And they just simply don't have the time because they are teaching 10 classes just to survive every year. So I think we need to think about this. What does it mean that it is mostly people who are at the center still, who can produce this kind of knowledge? Again, going back to the question of knowledge is power, and who tells the story is important, and how are we going to get the funding so that the people who are actually at the places that need to tell all these stories have the time and the funding to do so. So I think I'll stop there. You'll hear way more about my contribution to the World Humanities Report when I talk later. Thank you.
This is fantastic. I know you can't quite hear me enough, but let's just open things up to questions. I'm sure there are questions, there are comments, and if there aren't immediate questions and comments, I'd love to hear the panelists themselves respond to one another. But any questions, curiosities, reflections?
Several of you, maybe every panelist, repeated the well-known phrase, knowledge is power. And I'm sure it is sometimes, but I'm wondering if at least in the United States, there's been a concerted attack on expertise. And I think that attack is characteristic of populist right-wing regimes elsewhere as well. So I'm wondering if, in fact, to some extent, the power of particular kinds of knowledge has been lessened or erased, or what you think about that possibility.
Are we collecting questions, or are we?
I think we can go one by one, I think. Let's do one by one. If you have an answer.
Who wants to talk first? You go ahead. Should I? No? Really? Alan doesn't work for this.
No, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question, but being the philosopher at the table, talking about disciplinary boundaries here, I would just like also put in question what do we mean by power when we say knowledge is power, right? Hannah Arendt, who hated to be called a philosopher, but I think she's one of the great philosophers in the 20th century, she really pointed to this, like power needs to be at the hands, or power happens precisely when we don't close off possibilities. And so the kind of power, in scare quotes, that is scared of knowledge, Arendt would say that's power, that's not power, that's something else, right? What I think is important is how do we make sure that where power exists, which is where the actual possibilities of interpreting and giving meaning to the world are opened and not closed, how do we guarantee that that has enough audibility? And to give audibility, I think, is one of the ways to resist oppression. This would be short.
I'm happy to chime in, just simply because, David, this attack on expertise, we see it happening in the United Kingdom, but interestingly, in Ireland's different. And maybe the difference is instructive, because what we've found is our government is actually, I mean, as politicians go, they're as good as you're going to get. They're civilized, they appreciate, value education. The problem is they don't give us any money. But actually, I've found that they're extraordinarily well disposed towards expert knowledge. The dilemma that I have is that it's all about bread on the table today, and that came out of a period of austerity. And now Ireland actually has money again. It's convincing them of the importance of investing in the long term, and but maybe because of the success of Ireland's writers and filmmakers and script. Obviously the Oscars recently, 11 Irish nominees. I mean, it was disproportionately large. So they value that, and they understand the importance of the arts and humanities in terms of the global reputation. So it's how we convert that into cash, how we convert that into investment. Our Chancellor of the Exchequer, our finance minister, I met him about recently, and he said to me, Jane, I know you well, I take you to bed every night. And I was so embarrassed, because I was like, what on earth, and he, what are you talking about? I was like, are you sure you've got the right person? And I had edited a book called The Cambridge History of Ireland, and he was reading the Cambridge History of Ireland, so he literally was. But that isn't surprising, we've got ministers who love books, read books, who are smart, and so it's a very different experience for us compared to what, I'm hearing of others.
I know very well what you're, referencing. It's not the case in the Arab region, really. I think there isn't a kind of populist disenchantment with knowledge and with education. I think the problem is rather top-down, and which kinds of knowledge and which kinds of expertise are valued and which kind aren't. And what Lydia was saying about China and the sort of neoliberal turn in universities and so on is very, very powerful in the universities of the Middle East and of the Arab region. And so what's more interesting, I think, what's been happening is with the popular protests and uprisings and so on, there has been a questioning and a critique of traditional academic knowledge, both in terms of the kind of knowledge and expertise it produces, but the forms through which it is communicated with the public have been a matter of debate. And so in the public squares, there was a lot of discussion and real struggle over, whether the people in the street wanted to hear from academics, but it wasn't a rejection of knowledge per se, but rather the way in which, the top-down way in which knowledge tends to be presented and disseminated, and that's very interesting, I think, to watch.
Well, I'm not sure that knowledge is power is my thing. I never use that. If you ask me, if you really push me, I would say the information machine is power. Then the answer is, would you want to seize the information machine? That's an open question.
Yeah, Cotter.
Thank you. I really have a huge respect for what you tried to do to bring the world together under this lens of the humanities. So I want to know more about the process of dividing it into regions, and also about your overall objective. Is it to capture the state of the humanities in different regions today for conceptualizing something for the future? Is it something reflective about the past? And the other questions, of course, how do you deal with regions where academic freedom has been curtailed for decades or is curtailed right now? So how do you overcome all of this? So how do you preserve critical distance and at the same time present a comprehensive view of the humanities worldwide? So it's a really huge task. I congratulate you for even daring to put this together, but I'd like to know more about the process and the challenges that I'm sure that you've experienced in these past years, and hear more about the regions that are missing. Of course, I'm totally curious about what did you do with Turkey? Who did you ask? How do you decide who to ask to make any contributions? But I guess I'll have to wait until that's out. But in general, so that's the whole process of preserving that critical distance while trying to come up with a comprehensive view is something that we'd all like to do. So how did you make that possible in places? Did you fail in places and had to revisit, let's say, the narrative of a region? And I'm sure there are lots of really interesting stories behind what you've done in the past year. So if you could give us a glimpse of that, I'd be really grateful.
Absolutely. I'll start, and others of you who have participated should absolutely step in. We failed over and over again, and I would say this, in some ways, it is a document of certain kinds of failures, and I can talk about what those are. And we knew from the outset that we wouldn't be comprehensive. We decided to start from the regions. It was a very early decision. When the origins of this project, we were working much more closely with CHCI, which was developed in the aftermath of World War II to be the kind of consciousness and the conscience of UNESCO. And so their major contribution at that time was a very large book documenting the Third Reich. So what CHCI's kind of origin story is like they were invited to be responsible in some way for the failure of the UN, of UNESCO, in the failure of the world system to recognize what was taking place. I'm muddling my history, but they were asked to contribute to this volume, or to conceive this volume on the Third Reich. So when we first started to think about this, we thought, okay, how could this book, this massive volume that's both historical, but not designed only to be historical, designed to be a history, someone talked earlier about a history of the future, not really a history of the future, but a history that would make a future possible. And so that was kind of the project that was in the back of our minds. And then we thought, one way to try to ensure that this was not a North American only or European only project was to think regionally, recognizing that the regional model is imperfect, or think continentally, but it didn't quite work continentally because the Arab region is a linguistically organized project in many ways, and the Americas are now conceived of as one overarching region rather than a kind of north-south narrative about the Americas. So Russia is a project unto itself, and not part of these projects. Turkey and Israel were the two that were actually quite difficult to fit in, and both, with Israel there was an existing report, and with Turkey we commissioned a kind of modest report, but it's by no means comprehensive. So that's just kind of to riff a little bit on this. Other failures, it took us quite a while to figure out how to represent Asia and China, how to represent India and South Asia. And I think those were two areas of challenge. Those were two of the areas that were most every area had its own challenge. We worked closely with a series of different colleagues in Africa, and ourselves at CHCI had worked on a kind of African humanities report early on to try to think about how we could better engage with colleagues in Africa. But when it actually came to producing this project, every person we started to work with would somehow just disappear, not in a kind of sense of here, but they just simply didn't have the time. I mean, back to Maria's point, is like, even if we gave funding, even if we gave support, the time commitment to do something outside of your everyday habits actually turned out to be tremendously difficult, particularly in Africa. So, but what does that actually show us? I mean, because I kind of narrated all the way, and even telling a story about the United States proved tremendously difficult. Tremendously difficult to tell a story about the United States. We now have a kind of institutional history of the United States, but what does that tell us, and what is this for? And I think that's your question. So initially this was for UNESCO, and it still has some sense at UNESCO, and now the US has rejoined and there are other moves afoot. The UNESCO is interested in the recommendations. So there is this kind of organizational community. We wanted to think about how an account of the humanities, more or less now, not kind of 50-year history or 200 or Enlightenment and beyond history of the humanities, would tell us about the humanities today. We wanted to focus on a set of snapshots or interventions, much of what you've started to hear, and how that could be useful for all of us to know where we should go next. Like, where are the humanities flourishing? And I think what we just heard now, that there's plenty of funding and there's no funding in two regions of the world at the same time, is absolutely fascinating. And I think that is one of the high-level stories for us to understand, is what happens when the funding for the humanities has left Europe in many ways and moved to China, and yet the agenda in China, particularly the kind of neoliberal agenda that you're describing, maybe doesn't actually support the humanities as conceived elsewhere, but the funds are there. So how do we live in this situation of unevenness? And what should we do? What should the intervention be when we know that it's not that there's no funding, it's just what are the costs of funding? And then we hear you don't even have access to the funds that you have in Beirut. So then I think this should be a resource for each of you to be able to say, where do I intervene? How do I intervene? Where do we collectively intervene? How do we intervene not only from our particular institution or our particular language or our particular region, but as a collective to see that these are our collective projects. I guess the final thing to say is the question of academic freedom, the questions of exile. The Russia report was being written right at the moment at which the war in Ukraine came to be and was unfolding, and and by scholars who always are at risk of being displaced and in exile. Some of whom are, I think, still in the U.S. Both of them, I think, have left Russia since. Both of the people who wrote the Russia project had been in Russia and now no longer are. So, I mean, this is an on-the-ground also account of the perilous position, not only of the humanities, but of humanists. And I think that's part of the story. So it's a long answer because it's an enormous project, and it's one that in no way could succeed, but its success would be to figure out when each of us exist in certain institutions, have to make a claim for what you're doing. What is it to have access to a larger body and a larger set of claims? And a document that you can point to say, this is not just me and my little center in wherever I might be in, Wisconsin or in Switzerland or anywhere else in the world, but this is a world project and problem, and each of our contributions matter to it. So.
Sarah, can I just say, firstly, congratulations. I just want to echo what Lydia said. To yourself, to Guillaume, to the whole team. I'm just seeing it for the first time this afternoon. It really is incredible. I know nothing is ever perfect, but I mean, it's a huge achievement, and it's something to be, I think, enormously proud of. I'm deeply sorry that Europe it doesn't have a box there. For those of you may be aware, there is a European volume coming out it's the Edinburgh Companion to the New European Humanities, edited by Rosie Bradotti and a number of others. And I hope it can appear on this website, because I think it needs to be there. The other thing is those 10 recommendations. Wow. And I think it's incumbent on each and every one of us to circulate those. I'll send a tweet later. I'll tag our Minister for Research and Education. I'll tag our, the key figures who are the influencers. So again, just heartiest congratulations.
I wanted to just add one more point. That is the important connection with the UNESCO initiative, because UNESCO, whatever you can say about UNESCO, it was one of the first places where the voices against racism emerged. I mean, from an official organization. And in fact, the origins of UNESCO, I have done some archival work in the archives of UNESCO, had some surprising findings, and those of you who are interested in to take a look, including, for instance, as early as 1942, the Conference of Allied Ministers of Education raised the question of racism, not just in the context of the Holocaust, but also in the context of colonialism. Okay, so very early, Levi-Strauss, Freud, were all involved in the communication about how to fight racism, and both before the founding of UNESCO, because the founding of UNESCO is related to the Allied Ministers, the Conference of Allied Ministers of Education, right? And so it was one of their central tasks to raise the issue, to prevent war, to achieve peace, and they saw racism at the root of all conflicts global conflict. And so I'm very pleased to see that they're going back to that tradition, and they invite people, humanists, to contribute to that cause. I think this cause is so my part, when Sarah asked me to join, I was motivated by this awareness. I said, gee, great, UNESCO is doing this, and we have yet to hear from the global south. You know, whoever, you know, gives the voices, but we need to have a starting point. You know, let's hear, you know, let's listen what they have to say about their problems and their future, their vision.
I think that's a great point. All of these are incredibly important points, and there is this sense that this is a parallel to what had been a series of World Social Science reports, which is a project that now is kind of just taken, I think is on pause, but at the same time, it has this sense of responsibility in the face of what we talked about the other day as political urgencies or societal urgencies. And it's not comprehensive, it's not monolingual, truly, in both the metaphorical and the literal sense, but it is something I invite you all to respond to, think about, and it has the potential to be a living project, not one that, and that's why it's digital, not one that is closed at the moment it goes to press. So thank you to all of you both for this panel and for the incredible work that you've done. Thank you to the Medical Humanities panel for giving us a little extra time. And I look forward to further conversations with all of you. So thanks.
Great.
That was great. Okay. Yes, of course. Fabulous.
It's amazing. I was like,
Great.
The report.
Great. Okay.
Yeah, oh, I was so curious to see. I mean, it looks terrific. And the Arab one looks amazing.
Should we run down?
Amazing. What?